Hello and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching installing VMware ESXi version 4. In this video, I'll talk about why hardware compatibility is so important when it comes to selecting the physical hardware for your VMware ESXi server. I'll show you how to check the hardware compatibility on VMware's website, and then I'll cover the official hardware requirements for VMware ESXi. Next, I'll talk about why ESXi is the real deal when it comes to virtualization software. A lot of people think that ESXi is some version of ESX that has limited functionality. ESXi is a high-performance, fully functional virtualization platform that offers all the features of the vSphere suite. Then I'll move on and compare the three different types of VMware ESXi, including the free version, the installable version, and the embedded version. From there, I'll show you how to download ESXi and install VMware ESXi step by step. And then I'll finish up the video by covering the 5 steps that you'll need to perform to configure your new ESXi server. And with that, let's get started. Alright, why is hardware compatibility so important when it comes to installing VMware ESXi? Well, ESXi isn't your typical software application that you install inside, let's say, Windows Vista. ESXi runs directly on your hardware, and ESXi talks directly to your devices like your video card, your SATA or SCSI controller, and your network interface card. In other words, ESXi is your operating system. You're not installing it on top of another operating system like you would install VMware Workstation or VMware Server. Now, when it comes to selecting hardware for ESXi, typically newer name brand servers will be compatible, but there's no guarantee of that. I encourage you to check out VMware's hardware compatibility list to ensure that your server will be compatible with VMware ESXi before you purchase ESXi or before you purchase a new server. Now, you can even run VMware ESXi inside Workstation to test out the functionality of VMware ESXi. But just because ESXi runs inside Workstation doesn't mean that your hardware is compatible with VMware ESXi. I've got a video in this series on how to run VMware ESXi inside Workstation. Alright, so how do you find out if your hardware is compatible with VMware ESXi? The number one place you need to go is vmware.com/go/HCL, and that stands for the Hardware Compatibility List. Now, when you go to that URL, it'll take you to a website that says Search the Compatibility Guide, and that's what you'll use to find out if your hardware is compatible with VMware ESXi. And I'll show you how to use it here in just a second. Now, just because your hardware isn't on the list doesn't mean that it's not compatible with VMware ESXi. If you're able to test out some existing hardware without buying a brand new server, I encourage you to try out VMware ESXi for yourself to see if it is compatible. Now, something else to keep in mind is that just because ESXi runs on your physical server doesn't mean that your server is going to work with vMotion or VMware's new fault tolerance. There's a separate URL that you can reference for vMotion and fault tolerant requirements. And I'll include that URL in the reference for this video. And then finally, keep in mind that there are separate hardware compatibility lists for storage area network hardware, I/O interfaces, guest operating systems, and more. So now let me show you this hardware compatibility list. And this is the VMware Hardware Compatibility Guides website. You can see here that there's 2 different compatibility guides. There's actually the VMware Certified Compatibility Guide, which is what I was talking about when I referenced the HCL, or the Hardware Compatibility List. And then there's the Community-Supported Hardware and Software Compatibility Guides. If you find that your hardware isn't on the VMware Certified Compatibility Guide, I encourage you to go out to the community and find out if your hardware might have been tested by a community member and they've posted the compatibility for that hardware on the website. Now, in the reference for this video, I'll also include some links to some white box websites. A white box is a generic server that you build that's compatible with VMware ESXi. There's some great websites out there that a number of bloggers have put together where they documented the generic server that they built that was compatible with VMware ESXi. So for now, let's go to the VMware Certified Compatibility Guide. And if we scroll down here, you can see at the top of this, it says Search the VMware Compatibility Guide. That's what we want to do. We can scroll down here and we can select VMware ESXi Installable, which is the typical version of VMware ESXi that you would download from the VMware website. You could scroll down here and you could select the brand of server that you have. In our case, at the Wired Brain Coffee Company, we have a Dell server. You can select the form factor and CPU information. For now, let's just say search, and let's see what we get. Alright, I'm going to scroll down here and you can see all the different Dell servers that are compatible with VMware ESXi. Now at the Wired Brain Coffee Company we have a Dell T610, and it isn't on the first page of the Dell hardware compatibility list, but let's go to the second page. And there it is right there. A PowerEdge Dell T610 is compatible with VMware ESXi Installable. It says right there. Alright, we know that our hardware is compatible with VMware ESXi, and that means that we can go back to our slides. Alright, so what are VMware's official hardware requirements for VMware ESXi? Well, keep in mind that ESXi version 4.0 will only install and run on servers with 64-bit x86 CPUs. This is very critical. That means that older servers with 32-bit CPUs are not compatible with VMware ESXi. Believe me, I've tried to install ESXi on 32-bit CPUs, and the installer will come up and tell you flat out that it won't work. Now, the known 64-bit processors are AMD Opterons, Intel Xeon, and the new Intel Nehalem 64-bit processors. VMware ESXi requires a minimum of 2 GB of RAM, and it requires 1 or more Gig Ethernet controllers. They also recommend a dedicated network interface card for the virtual machines. Now, when it comes to storage, VMware ESXi has very similar storage requirements as compared to VMware ESX. You need some kind of SCSI adapter, fiber channel adapter, internal RAID controller, SAS controller, or SATA drive. However, installing VMware ESX on a fiber channel SAN is experimental. And installing VMware ESX on a SAN, such as a NAS or iSCSI, is not supported. And what that really means is that you should install VMware ESXi on your local drives. Of course, you can attach your ESXi server to a SAN and then store your virtual machines on the storage area network, and that's recommended. In fact, you're going to have to do that to use many of the advanced features such as vMotion, Storage vMotion, and vMHA. Now, VMware ESXi cannot use a SATA CD-ROM unless you enable IDE emulation. Now, here's a few installation notes about VMware ESXi that I wanted to point out. Don't forget that ESXi has no service console. It only has the direct console, which is that yellow and gray firmware console that you'll see after we install ESXi. But you should also know that you can access the unsupported service console, and I'll show you how to do that at the end of this video. And something else to keep in mind is that because ESXi has no service console, some third-party applications that say they're compatible with VMware ESX may or may not be supported or may not work with VMware ESXi. Now, many people think that VMware ESXi is some skimmed-down version of VMware ESX. It's not as powerful and not as fully functional. And in this slide, I want to point out that VMware ESXi is the real deal. And what I mean is that the commercial version of VMware ESXi, perhaps not the free version, but the commercial version of VMware ESXi is fully functional, and in many ways it may or may not be better than the full edition of VMware ESX. Now, it does have the direct console instead of the full console as compared to ESX, but ESXi is potentially better than the full version of VMware ESX. And that's because, think about it, because it doesn't have that service console, it takes up fewer resources on the physical server, and it requires less patching, because that Linux console that's in the full version of ESX is based on Linux. There's going to be Linux patches for that service console, and that's going to require more patching of a full version of VMware ESX, whereas ESXi isn't going to have as much patching to do on the service console. In fact, no patching really to do for the service console. And also, it's going to be potentially more secure because it's not going to have all the services that would be in the full version of VMware ESX in the service console. In other words, it just doesn't have as much to break, and it doesn't have as much to hack by a malicious attacker. And the commercial version of VMware ESXi allows for all the advanced vSphere features. That means that you can use DRS, you can use vMotion, Storage vMotion, fault tolerance, vMHA. All these features are available and work just as well on ESXi as they do on the full version of VMware ESX. Now, ESXi installs and boots much faster than the full version of VMware ESX. In fact, I highly recommend that you install ESXi instead of ESX unless there's something that you need out of the service console that's in ESX. And honestly, I don't see that being the case. Really, most people just don't need that service console. ESXi does everything that they need to do and more. Alright, so VMware ESXi is available in 3 different versions, and this can get confusing because it's all called ESXi, but there's these 3 different versions. There's the free version, there's the installable version, and the embedded version. Now, the free version has unlimited use. You don't have to buy anything. You download it, you get a license via email, and it's completely free. But it does have some limitations. For example, any changes that you make inside the service console or the unsupported service console are completely read-only. That means if you reboot it, those changes aren't going to be there anymore. Also, there's some SNMP limitations if you're using SNMP to access the free version of VMware ESXi. And then, of course, you're not going to be able to use the free version of VMware ESXi with all of the advanced features. You're going to have to purchase the commercial version. Now, typically when people purchase the commercial version of VMware ESXi, they're purchasing the installable version, not the embedded version. So that installable version is what you download and install on your own server, and it fully supports all the advanced vSphere features that you have licensed. When you purchase one of the vSphere suites, you have the choice of using VMware ESXi or the full version of VMware ESX. You can download both versions, and you could use whichever version you choose. Now, the embedded version of VMware ESXi is an image that's pre-installed in the firmware of a new server that you purchase from one of the server vendors. Let's say from Dell, you purchase a new server and you opt to have the embedded version of VMware ESXi factory installed or burned onto an external USB key that's connected to that server, and it's only licensed for that server. You cannot move it to another physical server. So that embedded version is very similar to the installable version, but it comes pre-installed on a brand new server. So those are the 3 different versions of VMware ESXi: the free edition, the installable edition, and the embedded edition. And in this video, I'll show you how to download and install the installable version or the commercial version of VMware ESXi. In my video on installing VMware ESXi in the SMB, I show you how to download and use the free version of VMware ESXi. So if that's what you're interested in doing, I suggest you watch that video covering using VMware ESXi in the SMB. Alright, so now let's talk about how to download and install VMware ESXi version 4. And again, we're not covering the free edition of VMware ESXi. This is the commercial version of VMware ESXi. So we're going to assume that you're using either the 60-day eval of VMware ESXi, or you're going with a registered license and you've already purchased it from VMware. So if you want that 60-day eval of VMware ESXi, you should go to vmware.com/tryvmware, or if you have that registered license, you should download the ISO from vmware.com/download. Now, VMware ESXi in either case is a 348 megabyte CD ISO image. So it's not a DVD, it's a CD ISO image, and that's compared to the 798 megabyte DVD image of the full version of VMware ESX. Alright, so now let me show you how to download VMware ESXi. We're going to go to this vmware.com/download. You can see right up here, vmware.com/download. And you can see the first option here is VMware vSphere 4. And if we click download, it brings us to this page where we can download not only the full version of VMware ESX4, but also VMware ESXi, VMware vCenter, VMware Consolidated Backup, and so on. So one of the things we can do here is we can view the release notes, which are very important to view when it comes to any version of VMware ESX or vCenter that you're downloading. In the release notes, you'll learn about what you need to do to get started, and you'll learn about any known issues that might affect your installation. I encourage you to check out the release notes before you download ESXi. So let's go back here and let's click download on the VMware ESXi version 4 option. What we'll need to do is to scroll down here and accept the license agreement. And I should also point out that I've already logged into the VMware website. So you'll be prompted to log into the VMware website, and you'll have that login if you've chosen to evaluate VMware ESXi with a 60-day eval, or if you've purchased VMware ESXi and the vSphere suite from VMware. You'll use your username and password to log in, and that'll give you access to download VMware ESXi. So if we scroll down here, you can see that ESXi is available in the CD ISO installable version. It says here it's 341 megabytes. You can also download the zip version, which you would use for an upgrade. It's 274 megabytes. Now you can also download the vSphere client and host update utility separately, although that's included in the installable version of VMware ESXi, and you can download the vSphere client directly from the ESXi server once ESXi is installed. You can download the VMware Tools CD for Linux, and you can also download the VMware SNMP MIB modules. Now in our case, we want to just download the ISO image right here for VMware ESXi version 4. I'm going to click on that, and it brings up the download manager, and at this point I can just say save file. Now before I say OK and save the file and start the download process, I can tell you that I've already downloaded VMware ESXi, so I can save us that time. I'll just say cancel here and close this out, and let's go back to our slides, and I'm going to show you the installation steps, and we'll go over to our ESXi server where I have that ISO image already ready to boot and install VMware ESXi. Now these are the 6 steps that you'll need to perform to install VMware ESXi version 4. The first step is you'll need to take that ISO image of VMware ESXi that you downloaded and burn it to a CD. You'll need to use a CD authoring software, of course, to do that, and you'll need to have a blank CD and a CD recordable drive to do that. Once you have that physical CD of VMware ESXi, of course, you'll put it in the drive of your server that you want to install VMware ESXi on. Now, alternatively here, and completely optional, if you have a server that has a server management card, many times you can mount that ISO image using virtual CD software that comes with that server management card. Now another alternative would be if you're installing VMware ESXi to test and evaluate inside VMware Workstation, you can mount that ISO image directly using VMware Workstation. Once you have the VMware ESXi image ready to boot, you'll boot that CD. Many times you'll have to press escape on the server to get to the BIOS boot manager to select that you want to boot from CD. You might also have to go into the BIOS and change your boot preferences to boot the CD. Once VMware ESXi boots up, it's a very quick and easy installation. You'll answer installation questions by pressing Enter, F11, Enter, F11. You'll reboot the server, and then you're ready to use VMware ESXi. Once the VMware ESXi server is booted, you can download and install the vSphere client and then connect to the server using that client. Now this is the exact process we're going to be using to install ESXi in just a minute, but first I have some installation tips and tricks. The first one is if you have a lot of ISO images and files that you've downloaded from VMware, let's say in your downloads folder, the image with the word vmvisor in the file name is VMware ESXi. Now you'll need to make sure that VT is enabled in your server BIOS to use VMware ESXi. And like I said, you may need to press escape or change the boot order in the BIOS to boot that installation CD. Now even on a slow computer, VMware ESXi installs and is ready to use in about 5 to 10 minutes. I can tell you it's less than half the time that it takes to install the full version of VMware ESX. Now unlike the full version of VMware ESXi installs in a 60-day eval mode. That means there's no option for you to use host-based licensing with VMware ESXi. In other words, it's not going to ask you for a license when you install VMware ESXi. It's just going to install, and then from there you can use the vSphere client or VMware's Virtual Center to configure licensing for your VMware ESXi server. And with that, we're ready to install VMware ESXi. I can tell you that I'll be using the option to install VMware ESXi inside Workstation so that I can record the installation process and show it to you in this video. And with that, I'm going to tab over to my server where I have the VMware ESXi ISO CD mounted and ready to boot inside my VMware ESXi server. Okay, we're on the console of our VMware ESXi server, and I very quickly pressed escape so that I could get to the boot menu. I'm going to scroll down here and select the CD-ROM drive because that's where I have the VMware ESXi ISO image ready to boot. Okay, I pressed enter there, and that brings up the VMware vmvisor boot menu. This is the installer for VMware ESXi. Here it's asking me if I want to boot either the ESXi installer or boot from the local disk. Of course, we want to boot the ESXi installer, and in fact, if I hadn't have pressed a button there, it would have automatically booted into the ESXi installer in just 10 seconds. So I'll press enter there, and that starts up the ESXi installer. Alright, here we go. It's starting the VM kernel initialization. You can see that it says VMware ESXi version 4.0 on the top, and there's the build number from the ISO image that we downloaded. You also saw that build number on VMware's website, build 164009. It tells us there the physical hardware that we're running on. So if you have a Dell server, let's say, it would say that you're running on a Dell server, and it would tell you the model and the CPU type and the amount of RAM that that server has. In our case, it tells us we have an Intel Core 2 Duo CPU. It's a T7300 platform with a 2 GHz CPU, and we have 2 GB of RAM. It loads a number of modules here, and then we'll be asked some questions about the installation. Okay, here we go. It says, welcome to the VMware ESXi 4.0 installation. VMware ESXi installs on most systems, but only systems on VMware's hardware compatibility guide or the hardware compatibility list are supported. Please consult VMware's hardware compatibility guide on vmware.com, and it says select the operation you wish to perform. Well, of course, in our case, we want to install VMware ESXi, so I'm going to press Enter. Alternatively here, you could press R for repair. So I'll press Enter. Here we have to accept the end user license agreement by pressing F11. If you think back to our installation steps, what did I say we would do? We would press Enter, F11, Enter, then F11. So here we're on the next Enter, and it's asking us what disk we want to install VMware ESXi on. Well, in our case, we only have one disk, and it's already highlighted there. So I'm just going to press Enter, and then it asks us to confirm the installation by pressing F11. I'll press F11 there, and that starts the actual file copy process for VMware ESXi. This is just going to take a minute. In that time, I'm going to pause the video recording, and I'll be right back. Okay, there we go. Installation is complete. It says that VMware ESXi 4.0 has been successfully installed. Like I said over in the slides, ESXi installs in an evaluation mode and will operate for 60 days. To use ESXi after that evaluation period, you must register and enter a license from VMware. Now it tells us we must reboot the server to start using VMware ESXi. Be sure to remove the installation disk before you reboot. So I'll press Enter to reboot the server. This will take just a second, and then we can watch the boot process for VMware ESXi. Here we go. This is what VMware's ESXi boot process looks like. It says that it's loading the VMware hypervisor. And then we get that familiar yellow and gray screen. Now at this point, a number of services are started. You can see there it says running SLPD start, running WSMan start, and those services are started right at the end of the boot process. And here we go. VMware ESXi version 4.0 has booted successfulully, and we're taken to the Direct Console. Notice that it tells you can download the tools to manage this host from http://10.0.1.105, and it got that IP address by DHCP. That's the default for VMware ESXi, is to pull an IP address from DHCP. Notice here we can press F2 to customize the system, and we can press F12 to shut down or restart the system. Now before I press F2 to configure the new server, I have a list of tasks that we need to perform. So let me tab back to our slides and show you our task list. Alright, so the 5 steps that we need to perform to configure our new ESXi server are: number 1, we need to set the root password to secure the server, because by default the server has no password at all for the root account. Next, we need to configure an IP address on the server, subnet mask, default gateway, DNS servers, hostname, and a domain. I'll show you how to do that step by step. Next, you'll need to add the server's hostname and IP address to your DNS server. That's so that you can connect to the server using the DNS name. In other words, let's say that this server is going to be called VMware ESX5. We'll need to add an alias on our DNS server that's going to point to the static IP address for this new ESXi server. And I'll show you how to do that in just a second. Then if you're using VMware's vCenter, you'll want to add this new ESXi server to vCenter by DNS name. Now optionally, you'll want to configure lockdown mode on the server and then connect it to a SAN. So let's get started. Let me show you how to do these things. And in fact, let's first connect to our DNS server, and I'll show you how to create an alias for the new ESXi host. Okay, so here's our DNS server. This is the DNS server for the Wired Brain Coffee Company. So what we want to do is to add a new ESXi host. This is a Windows 2008 server already running DNS, and we'll be pointing the ESXi server to this DNS server for DNS resolution. This will also be the DNS server for our vCenter server and the DNS server that's configured on the client where we'll be running the vSphere client. So I'll right click here and I'll say that I want to add a new host or a record. I'll type in ESX5 and I'll go down to the IP address and type in the IP address I'm going to use, 10.0.1.15. That'll be a static IP address for the new ESXi server. I'll say add host there. It says the new host record was successfully created for ESX5.wiredbraincoffee.com. I'll say OK. We'll say we're done there. And notice that the new record is added. All right, so that's quick and easy. It was easy to add the new record for our ESXi server. All right, now we're back at our slides, and we just completed task number 3 already. Now we need to complete 1 and 2, and then we'll be actually adding this server to our vCenter server by DNS name once we've installed our vCenter server. In other words, not in this video, but in a future video. So let's tab over to the new ESXi server. We'll set the root password, we'll configure the IP address and the other network settings. So to go into the direct console, I'll press F2 where it says Customize System, and then this brings us into the system customization. So the first thing we said we need to do is to configure the root password. So right now we're already on Configure Password, and notice how it says it's not set. I'll press Enter here, and then we need to type in the new password. So I'll type in our root password there. We'll have to enter it twice, and I'll press Enter. And there we go. We just configured the root password for this ESXi server. Notice how now it says that it's set. We can go down to the next option here, which is to configure lockdown mode. Now, lockdown mode is what prevents remote users from logging into this host using the root login name. If no other login accounts exist, users will only be able to access this host through the local console or through an authorized centralized management application. So by default, no other local accounts are going to exist. So if I configured lockdown mode, we wouldn't be able to access this server using the root account. We'd only be able to access it using, let's say, VMware vCenter or through the console. Now, I'm not going to configure lockdown mode at this time. Let's go on down and let's configure the management network. So I'm going to press Enter on the management network configuration. And here we can configure our network adapters, our VLAN settings, IP configuration, IPv6 configuration, DNS configuration, and our custom DNS suffixes. So let's start by looking at our network adapters. Here we can see that we have one network adapter called VMNIC0, and that X next to it tells us that it's currently enabled, and you can see on the right that it is connected. You can also see the MAC address there. If we had multiple network adapters, we could enable or disable those network adapters in this section of the direct console. I'm going to press Escape to go back one level, and then let's go down to the IP configuration. Now, like I said, by default, the ESXi server pulled an IP address from my local DHCP host, but we want to set a static IP address on this server, just like we do on all other servers in our network infrastructure. So I'm going to select that option there by pressing space, and then I'll go down using the arrow keys here to the IP address. So I'm going to type in the IP address 10.0.1.15. That's the same IP address we mapped to the ESX5 hostname over on the DNS server. The subnet mask is actually correct already, and so is the default gateway. Those were pulled from DHCP. I'll press Enter here to confirm that those settings are good, and notice it says that the new IP address is 10.0.1.15. So we've configured that successfully. Let's go down to the DNS configuration. And now we want to configure the DNS servers manually. So I'm going to type in the IP address of the local DNS server at the Wired Brain Coffee Company, and then I'll type in a backup DNS server as well. I'll type in the server hostname. It's ESX5.wiredbraincoffee.com. I'll press Enter there to save those settings, and you can see that they're saved over on the right-hand side. Finally, we need to configure the custom DNS suffixes. And that's for when this server tries to connect to host names on the local network, the custom DNS suffix is appended to that host name. So in our case, it's the Wired Brain coffee.com domain. I'll press enter there, and that custom DNS suffix is saved. At this point, I'll press escape, and it asks us if we want to configure the management network. Are we sure we want to apply these changes and restart the management network? I'll press Y to save the changes and restart the management network, and then I'll press escape to go back one level. There we go. Now on the right, we can see that our host name is ESX5, and we can see the static IP address that we configured. Some other things we can do here are to manually restart the management network. We can test the management network and disable the management network. Let's go ahead and test out our management network to ensure that the IP address settings that we configured are correct. What it's going to do here by default is to ping the default gateway and the primary and secondary DNS servers. Then it's going to try to resolve its own host name. I'm just going to press enter here, and it'll start these tests. You can interrupt the test at any time by pressing escape. So it tells us that it successfully pinged the default gateway, the primary DNS server, the backup DNS server, and then it was able to resolve its own host name. That should tell us that all of our IP address settings are correct, and also that the DNS alias that we configured over on our DNS server is also correct. In other words, it was able to resolve ESX5.wirebraincoffee.com to the IP address of this server, 10.0.1.15. I'll press enter here, and then I'll show you just a couple other things you can do in the direct console. You can configure the keyboard. You can view support information on this server, such as the server's serial number. You can also view system logs. I can press 1 here for the system messages, and I can press Q to get out of that. I can press 2 for the configuration log, and I can press Q again to get out of that, and I can press 3 for the host D system log. So in other words, there's 3 different system logs you can view from the system console in ESXi. Finally, I can choose to restart management agents. I could reset the system configuration. That would wipe everything clean, and then I can choose to remove custom extensions. For now, let's press escape to log out of the direct console. Now let me show you a few other things that you can do with the ESXi console. If you hold down Alt and press F12, this takes you to the VM kernel log. Here you can see things that are going on real time with the VM kernel. For example, at the bottom you can see how we changed the IP address and we changed the host name of the server. Alright, I just pressed Alt F2 to go back to the direct console login. And something else you can do is press Alt F1, and this actually takes you to the text console for VMware ESXi. However, unlike the full version of VMware ESX, you don't get a login prompt. But I did say I would show you how to access the unsupported and hidden ESXi console. To do that, you type the word unsupported here, and you won't get any echo back on the screen. Okay, I typed unsupported and I pressed enter, and I'm prompted for the password. This is the root password that we just configured in the direct console. Alright, it tells us that we've activated tech support mode, and that this tech support mode is not supported unless used in consultation with VMware's tech support. Now, in this hidden command line for VMware ESXi, you have a very limited command set. You can cd into sbin and do an ls-l on ESX asterisk, and you can see the typical ESX config commands that you would find in the full version of VMware ESX. However, 99% of the other Linux commands that you would be used to in the full version of VMware ESX are not found in this very scaled down, hidden, and unsupported version of the ESXi console. Alright, to get out of here, we type exit and press enter, and then we can hold down Alt and press F2 to go back to the direct console. So now let's bring up our web browser and point it to this new static IP address for our ESXi server. And let's go up here to the URL, and I'll just type in ESX5, and we'll verify that our domain name resolution actually works that we configured in our Windows 2008 DNS server. Now initially we get this secure connection failed, and it looks like a pretty ugly looking error, but I can tell you this is normal until you create an exception inside your web browser for your VMware ESX server. I'll say get certificate and then confirm security exception, and we'll make sure that permanently store this exception is checked. From there, we're taken to the web interface for this ESXi server. Now, the most useful thing, in my opinion, that you can do here is to download the vSphere client. It downloads it directly from that ESXi server. Now, some of the other things you can do here are to download VMware vCenter, access the vSphere 4 documentation, and download the vSphere remote command line. However, all of those things will actually just take you to the VMware website. Now, you can also browse the data store on this ESXi server using your web browser. Now, in our case, we've already downloaded and installed the VMware vSphere client. Let me go down here and run the vSphere client, and we'll connect to ESX5. I'll type in the root username and the password that we configured in the direct console. Again, we'll get an SSL certificate warning, and we'll say ignore here. And there we go. This brings up the VMware ESXi server that we just configured. It tells us that we're running an evaluation license that will expire in 60 days. I'll say OK there, and we can go to the Summary tab, and we can see the manufacturer of our server. In our case, it's VMware. However, if you installed this on a physical server, it would be Dell, IBM, or HP. You can see that this server has one CPU core, and it's a 2 GHz CPU. You can see the processor type, and that we have 2 GB of RAM. Alright, and with that, we've proven that our VMware ESXi version 4 server was successfully installed, our DNS alias was configured correctly, and we're able to access our ESXi server using both the web interface and the vSphere client. And with that, we can go back to our slides, and we can move on to the summary for this video. So what did we learn in this video? Well, we talked about why hardware compatibility is so important, and that's because ESXi is your operating system and it installs directly on your server hardware. I showed you how to check your hardware compatibility using the hardware compatibility guide or the hardware compatibility list. I talked about the official hardware requirements for VMware ESXi, and when it comes to version 4, the most important thing is that you have a 64-bit server, because that's absolutely required by ESXi version 4. We covered why ESXi is the real deal, in my words, and that's because it can perform all the advanced features of the VMware vSphere suite. And in fact, VMware ESXi may have some advantages over the full version of VMware ESX, because it installs faster, it boots faster, and it has less patches that you have to apply to maintain it. From there, we compared the 3 different types of VMware ESXi: the free version, the installable version, and the embedded version. Then I showed you how to download and install VMware ESXi version 4. And I covered the 5 steps to configuring your new ESXi server step by step. And then I ended the video by showing you how to access the unsupported and hidden console for VMware ESXi, and then we proved that our ESXi installation was successful by accessing it with our web browser and then with the VMware vSphere client. Thanks for watching this video covering installing VMware ESXi version 4.